Test. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. There we go. Good morning. We're just about to get started. I'm a little bit late, but story of my life. We're glad you're here this morning. Those of you in person, those of you online, thanks for joining us. We are walking through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And when last we came together, we were in Genesis 19. We talked about Sodom and Gomorrah. This week we're going to move into 2021, 22. So if you have your Bible, you want to catch up with where we're at, that's where we are scripturally. It's interesting when we get to chapter 21. There's an old Julie Andrews movie. I couldn't remember the name of the movie, so if one of y'all know it, you can feel free to. This is not a trivia game, but you can shout it out. But she sings this song. Nothing comes from nothing, nothing ever could, so somewhere in my youth or childhood, I must have done something good. Anybody remember that? Say it again? Sound of Music? Okay, I thought so, but, I wasn't sure enough to... My mom made me sit through that a lot. I'm sorry, we watched that a great deal. At any rate, that idea is kind of a lot of Christians' theology. That we have this Christianized version of karma, that if I am doing what I'm supposed to do, then good things are going to happen to me, and if I'm doing what I'm not supposed to do, then bad things are going to happen to me. And we don't articulate it like that because we don't really want to admit that, but we do. And when something bad happens to somebody, a lot of times we're like, well, I wonder what, and maybe I'm wrong, but I've heard it too many times. And the truth, though, is that it doesn't ever work that way. God says obedience brings blessing. I'm not refuting that or downplaying that. But sometimes God will allow troubles, trials, things to come into our life to help us grow, to make us stronger for whatever reason. And sometimes we don't even understand it. I mean, that's the whole point of Job, right? When Job, you're always growing up, you were told about the patience of Job, but you read the book, Job loses his patience and starts yelling at God. God, come down here. I want to meet you in a court. I want to take you to court. I want to sue you. I want you to explain to me what's going on. And God actually shows up and says, when you can hang a moon, then you get to ask questions. Until then, shut your mouth. And that's basically Job. And we don't like that because we want a nice, neat little bow and answers. And God says, you don't need to know answers. You just trust that I'm in control and I know what I'm doing. I say all that to say, when we get to chapter 21, we in 20, Abraham once again did the same thing that he had done before. He passes off his wife as his sister. He's done the same thing before, right? And here we go again, same story, different king, same sin, different situation, and here he goes, he passes her off, and the real tragedy is that when you read chapter 20, there doesn't seem to be a lot of repentance. There doesn't seem to be a lot of sorrow or anything on Abraham's part. He just kind of moves. And so to me, I think, well, there are a couple things I like from that. One is it encourages me because God's still going to bless me even when I keep messing up. That's what I'm hoping I can take out of that. But the second thing is Abram seems to be at a real low place in his spiritual life. He does not seem to be really plugged into God. Now, if you're honest, and if we're honest with ourselves, our spiritual life sometimes is in waves, right? There are times when you feel really, really close to God and really on a spiritual high, and there are times when you really feel like, man, I'm just barely holding it together. And we don't like to admit that, but it's true, and it's true for all of us. It's true for me. It's true for for a lot of people. There are times when it's up and down. And so it's encouraging to me that God brings about one of his greatest promises to Abraham, the greatest fulfillment, the fulfillment of one of his greatest covenant promises when he is at a low point. He has just committed the same sin that he's committed before. He has just once again failed, and he's at this low place, and that's when God brings about the promised son. That's encouraging to me. And maybe I'm weird, but before we get there, there are some things to get. Well, there's three different dimensions that you can see in chapter 21, the birth of Isaac, verse 1 through 7. One is that this is an act of God. Now, I have a friend who's in insurance, and he'll tell you that an act of God is what? A natural disaster, or something we have no control over. Isaac is an act of God, and it's very clear that 100-year-old Abraham, 90-year-old Sarah did not do this in any way of their own power. This is an act of God. This is the result of divine intervention in the lives of Abraham and Sarah. Let's look at chapter 21, verse 1 and 2 real quick. If you have your Bibles, you can read along. Then the Lord took note of Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had promised. So Sarah conceived and bore a son to Abraham in his old age at the appointed time of which God had spoken to him. Now let's talk about that for a minute, because there are some things that are striking about this passage. First of all is the calm assurance. I mean, what I like about this is that there's not suspense or great fanfare. It's not even like this is a surprise. It's God did what he said he was going to do. It's not. It reminds me a lot of the time of a lot of the way Jesus did miracles. You know, everybody was astonished except Jesus, and Jesus is kind of like, not that big a deal. I mean, you know, just don't go telling everybody about it. Don't go making a big thing about it. That's kind of the way he was with all the miracles. That's kind of the way it is here. It's just this calm assurance, this matter of fact. God did what he said he was going to do. Second, there's a distinct emphasis on fulfillment, right? This is happening. This birth of Isaac is happening because God promised it would happen. That it's important to the writer here that we get that this is a fulfillment of the covenant promise. 4 times in these verses, as he had said, as he had promised, at the appointed time, which God had spoken. Or this language of fulfillment. It's God who promises the child. It's God who accomplishes his word. It's on schedule. It's according to God's purpose. And then third, in this passage at least, verse 1 and 2 of chapter 21, the son seems to be given almost more for Sarah's benefit than for Abraham. Catch that? Read that again with me. I'm going to read it from a different version. Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age at the very time God had promised him. If you look at that, the emphasis here is not on the promise to Abraham, that God had made the promise to him, but the grace. God was gracious to Sarah. God did for Sarah. I don't think it's too far afield to maybe say that Sarah wanted this more than Abraham did. Here's why I say that. Abraham, remember, had already tried to convince God, I already got this kid over here. I already got Ishmael. So just bless him and you can fulfill your promises through him. You don't have to do all that stuff. Because Abraham's, he's done. He's fine. I got what I needed. Everything's okay. I can move on. Sarah, on the other hand, remember we talked about before, women have no value in this society. Remember in Sodom and Gomorrah, the guy says, no, don't rape this stranger, rape my daughter. Really? What? But that's because in that society, women had no value whatsoever. The only value they had was through childbearing. And Sarah is nearly 100 years old and has not had a child. And so in that society, he has very little value. In her mind, in her heart, she is holding on to this promise as much or more than Abraham is, because this is fulfillment for her. This is grace to her. And so Abraham may not have had the desire or the longing for this child as much as Sarah, but God still keeps the promise. Abraham names him Isaac, which we've talked about before, means laugh, because Abraham laughed, Sarah laughed, and so that's gonna play in again. We're reminded again in the passage that Abraham is 100 years old, and so imagine that. You're 100, your wife is 90, and you have a newborn. I mean, I'm 50, and the thought of a newborn, no. Right? I mean, I remember what that was like. I don't want to do that now. There's a reason why the young people have the babies, because we ain't going to do that. I mean, right? Am I wrong? Y'all back me up here. The idea of drawing Social Security, I mean, they've been drawing Social Security for 35 years and they become a parent. They're going to hit the teenage years at 113. I'm just hitting the teenage years, y'all. Some of y'all are laughing now because you're like, oh, you don't know. I'm telling you, I'm always in trouble. I don't know half the time why I'm in trouble. I'm just used to it being all my fault, so I just go with it. Abraham's response is dutiful acceptance, but Sarah, let's check back in verse 6 through 7. And Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. We said the name Isaac means laughter, and that's not lost on them. Sarah, though, sees this as not laughing anymore because of the promise or the ridiculousness of the promise. Now she sees God has brought joy into my life, as he promised he would. God has brought laughter to me. And so she is delighted by this. But that delight is kind of short-lived. We're accustomed to talking about the sacrifice of Isaac. But I think what's interesting is in this chapter, we're going to see the sacrifice of Ishmael as well. The Isaac story will be the topic next week, but there's a reason, I think, why this story of Ishmael is wedged in here between the birth of Isaac and the sacrifice of Isaac. Abraham has two sons, of course. The first is the son of a slave woman. Hagar is with him. She's a slave, so she has no say-so in this. She's not with him by anything of her own. Yes, Robin. No, go ahead. That's the way I read it, yes. I read it that everybody who hears about this is going, not laugh at me, not think, that woman, but laugh with me, will share in my joy. That's the way I read it. I don't know, that would be worth, I can go back and peruse the Hebrew, but that's the way it's translated in most translations that I've seen. So I haven't examined it per se, but that's the way I read it. That she is saying that God has brought joy to me, and everybody who's with me everybody who hears this is going to share in that joy. And so Ishmael, you remember, is the product of Abraham trying to make God's promise work for him, right? God helps those who help themselves is not a new concept. Abraham says, well, God promised this, so I'm going to go ahead and make this happen because it's been a long time and he hasn't done anything, and so I'm just going to take it on myself to make this happen. And he does. And in Genesis 18, we got the promise, but then there is Hagar has Ishmael, and Abraham feels like, well, there you go. We've taken care of this. What God promised, I went ahead and did for him because he needs my help. And we've talked about before that we kind of do that, right? We kind of think that if I'm not here, this church is going to struggle. If I'm not here, God needs me to whatever. And we're going to help God because he needs us to help him fulfill. That's a different lesson. But as we get into verse 8, the Isaac, they have a big party, and the rabbis argue back and forth whether Ishmael is a teenager here. If you follow it through, Ishmael is a teenager at this point that this happens. However, later on in the story, he's going to be, it's going to be portrayed like he's a child that she just leaves under a bush or whatever. So you have to remember that Genesis is oral history that was written down sometime later. Right? Nobody, I mean, most people say Moses wrote it. Moses wasn't standing in the bushes going, hang on, Abraham, let me get that down. That wasn't the way it happened. This was told and retold for centuries, and then it was finally written down at some point later. So we still believe that it's inspired. We still believe that it's God-breathed. I'm not taking that away from it. I'm just saying that's how it came to be here. And so a lot of people will say, well, see, there's contradictions. It says this and it says this, and there's two creation stories and there's this. It's oral tradition from a nomadic people. And it doesn't make it any less true, but the stories are told and retold. It's going to be, that's the way it's going to be. Maybe that's not as big a deal to other people. I'm just taking that. At any rate, they have this big party, and Ishmael is laughing at Isaac. Now, there's argument back and forth here. Some people say, well, Sarah was being hateful to Ishmael because he was just laughing. And the word there is a variation off of Isaac's name. But it could mean laughter or mocking. And so it could mean either one. Some people will say, oh, Sarah was just being hateful and jealous and vindictive, and all this kid was doing was laughing. Paul, in the New Testament, says that he was mocking. If you want to hold your finger and turn over Galatians chapter 4, verse 28 through 30. I'll read it to you if you don't want to do that. Now you brothers like Isaac are children of promise. At that time, however, the son born by the flesh persecuted the son born by the Spirit. It is the same now. But what does the Scripture say? Expel the slave woman and her son, for the slave woman's son will never share in the inheritance with the free woman's son. Paul sees it as mocking, as persecution, as laughing at. And so back to this idea, I don't think Ishmael is totally innocent. Now, maybe a little bit of an overreaction to kick a 13-year-old out into the desert to die because he laughed at a baby. But that's just, I mean, we can have that conversation, but the bottom line is Paul sees it and translates it as persecution, as making fun of. Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar, verse 9, but Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham was mocking, And she said to Abraham, get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son. Yes. That's possible. It's possible. We know that she already mistreated Hagar once before, right? We've talked about that. Hagar is double. I told you women don't have any worth. Hagar is a slave and a woman, so she's even worth less than Sarah, and you see that in the way they treat her. She's not consulted. She's basically sexually abused by Abraham and Sarah. We got to call it what it is. She doesn't have any say-so in whether or not she has this baby. Nobody asks her. They just do it. And, so Hagar, in a lot of ways, is a tragic figure in this story. Probably, it doesn't say this. This is conjecture on my part. But probably she's an Egyptian slave. Probably she was given to Abraham the first time he lied about his wife when they were in Egypt, and he was worried that Pharaoh was going to kill him and steal Sarah, and so he pretended she was his sister, and so he got this big dowry from Pharaoh. Pharaoh gave him a bunch of livestock and slaves and stuff. Hagar was probably in that. Now, the Bible doesn't say that. We're basing that on conjecture that this is an Egyptian slave. Probably that's where she came from, but we don't know that for sure. Abraham doesn't want to do it. Abraham doesn't want to kick her out. Come back to this. The matter, verse 11, the matter distressed Abraham greatly because it concerned his son. And so he doesn't want to do this. He doesn't want to kick him out. He still sees, Ishmael's still his son, even though by another woman. But God tells Abraham to do what Sarah wants. Verse 12, but God said to him, do not be distressed about the boy and your slave woman. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. I will make the son of the slave into a nation also, because he is your offspring. And so they're kicked out into the wilderness. This interesting is the language, how it foreshadows the sacrifice of Isaac. Early the next morning, Abram took some food and a skin of water. That's going to be in chapter 22, early in the morning. He puts food and a skin of water on Hagar's shoulders. That's going to be in 22 with Isaac. And so you see that foreshadowing of what's happening here. That's why I say this sacrifice of Ishmael. Now, this is not the first time, obviously, that Hagar has wandered in the wilderness. We know that. In 16, she ended up speaking with Yahweh and calls him the God who sees, because he sees her. This time she has nowhere to turn. The story in chapter 21, she goes off and casts him under a bush. Where is it? Verse 15. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the boy under one of the bushes. Then she went off and sat down about a bow shot away, for she thought, I cannot watch the boy die. And as she sat there, she began to sob. So again, don't get hung up on how old the kid is, because it's really irrelevant for the point of the story. There's a lot of genealogical issues there, but if we make too much out of those. But anyway, let's come back to, in the first few syllables, the second time, Hagar is visited by God. And so, verse 17, God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what's the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. In Hebrew, the first few syllables of this verse, God heard, are the name Ishmael. That Ishmael's name is God heard. And so when it starts off, verse 17, God heard the boy crying, Ishmael. It's the only time in the whole story that Ishmael's name actually appears. And so it's interesting that it emphasizes God hearing the cries, and that being Ishmael's name. God opens Hagar's eyes to a well of water nearby, and just as in the next chapter, God's going to open Abraham's eyes to the ram in the thicket. And so here we go. This is what I want to talk about. So we get right here, and Hagar is off in the wilderness, and she thinks she's dying. She's at this absolute low point. And again, Abraham's at a low point. God brings the child of promise. Hagar here is at a low point. God steps in and opens her eyes, the Bible says, to the water. How does God step in to our lives today at our low points? How does God open our eyes? How does God intercede for us today? Now, it may not be miraculous voices from heaven like this, but I don't believe that God has stopped doing that. So that's the question. Don, is your hand up? Don says it starts with the breath of air we're breathing right this second. Elaborate on that a little bit. How do we even have life? That God steps in and shows us grace just by our very existence. Every day. All right? Good. Brenda. When she found out she had cancer, she felt God's presence. She felt like God was with her. And so that was, I would call that God opening your eyes. Okay. Anybody else? These lights make it really hard for me to see you, so you may have to wave a little bit. No? Oh, no. I'm going to restate that for the folks at home. Norma says sometimes it's a journey. That part of getting to that point is your eyes are opened because you've made this journey. Is that fair? A fair restatement? Because, I mean, if you've been around here very often, you've heard me say, one of my favorite things to say is that most of the great works of God begin in the wilderness. The wilderness is where God shows up. And I say that all the time because I think a lot of times people get in the wilderness and that's when they think God is furthest from them. When in reality it may be the other way around. She sees God. God sees her. Where? In the wilderness. Not in the tent. Not in the high points. God sees her. God speaks to her. God interacts with her in the wilderness at her lowest point. I think we miss that, and we have this again back to that flip-flop theology, but our Western theology tells us that we're only coming to God on the mountaintops. But really, I think scripturally we can make the case that God appears a lot more in the wilderness, in the valley, at the lowest point than He does. Not that He doesn't appear on the mountaintops, and maybe that's because our eyes are more open. I don't know. Robin? There you go. That Robin says, in his mind, a lot of times when we're at our lowest points are when we seek Him the most. That's why our eyes are open, because we're actually looking. Go ahead. That's true, and we don't like to admit that, but then when we get over that problem, it becomes all about us again. I've seen that happen a lot. I had some family. Sorry, I just tried to pull this out of my ear. I had family, and she got a diagnosis, and it was cancer, and called everybody, pray for me, pray for me, pray for me. And so we all prayed for her. And they had told her it was all over her body and da-da-da-da-da. She went to MD Anderson, and they found one little speck in the breast that was easily accessible and removable. And she said, oh, well, I guess that equipment in Jasper was just not as good. And I'm like, don't steal that glory from God. You've asked for prayers. We prayed, and between that time and the time you got here, your cancer went from all over your body to one little speck. Don't take that glory from God and give it to a machine. But we do that, Brenda. Look what it did for you. I say all the time that Brenda is one of the greatest preachers for the power of prayer, because she will tell you the difference that it makes in our lives. Ishmael grows up in the wilderness, becomes the father of a nation, the Ishmaelites. He also becomes the father-in-law of Esau, who is another overlooked son. His descendants appear a few other times in the biblical text. It's the Ishmaelites who sell Joseph into slavery. Muslim tradition, of course, cites Ishmael as the father of Islam. All of that will come later. For our purposes, it's an easily overlooked phrase. And God, verse 20, and God was with the boy. God is with the boy, this outcast son of Abraham. God is with his mother too, this Egyptian slave woman cast out. It's worth noting that Hagar sees God not once but twice, and even names God. That's a privilege that not many have had so far to this point in Genesis. Not even many of the chosen people will have that privilege. God's choosing of one particular over another. God's choosing of Isaac over Ishmael. This passage is one that will be cited by Calvinists as an example of election. If you're not familiar with that, the Calvinist theology is that God has chosen who will be saved before the creation of the world, and so you're predestined to be saved. Why does God choose one and not the other? Anybody want to tackle that? Either way, I'll take any of it. But yeah, in a general way, or specifically Isaac and Ishmael, why does God choose one and not the other? He's God. That's his privilege. Absolutely. And it's right, what we were talking about Job just a minute ago. When you can hang a moon, you get to ask questions. I'm God. I'm going to do what I'm going to do. That's good. Either way, Courtney says, either way, whether you're in favor or not in favor, God's showing that you can still be blessed. That he chooses some vessels for his purpose and some not, and we're left to struggle with this. I don't see this as an example of predestination or election. I see this as the grace of God. And you guys know, I've been telling you for a long time that grace is not something that just sprung up with Paul. That's throughout Scripture. And we see it right here. This is a story of grace. Ishmael is not a miracle or a product of God's covenant promise. He is a product of humans acting outside of the promise of God. He's a product of humans trying to play God. He's a product of Abram not doing and not being faithful and listening to what. But yet, despite all that, God doesn't cast him out like Abraham does. God doesn't shun him like Sarah does. God blesses him. God doesn't simply allow him to wander off and die. God was with the boy. It says that John Levinson, let me read you this, a Jewish scholar says this: Ishmael is read out of the covenant, but emphatically included in the promise that's larger than the covenant and preceded it. That God cares about the boy and provides for this son of Abraham too. I think this is an example of grace. This is an example of God being the God of the nations. That he's saying, I'm God, and I can bless who I want to bless. And yes, this one is my covenant. This one is my chosen, but I'm going to bless this one too, not because he's product of the covenant, not because he's a product of faithfulness, not because of any other reason than because I'm God. And God is always looking for the outcast. It's easy to overlook this story of Ishmael set between the birth and the sacrifice, but it's worth it to us if we pause and really think about God's care and providence. That God, we can't limit God's mercy. God hears the cry of the abandoned. God hears the cry of the outcast. I think that's one of the messages of Jesus. If you look at Jesus, who does Jesus reach the most? Jesus does not reach the religious establishment. Jesus does not reach the righteous people that are holy or whatever. In fact, those are the people that want to kill him. Jesus reaches out to the outcast, the ones that nobody else wants, the ones that nobody else has anything to do with, the ones that the religious establishment, even if some of them have told, you're not welcome. And Jesus is God incarnate, God made flesh, and through Jesus we get to know the Spirit of God, we get to know the heart of God, and I think we see that heart way back here in Genesis 21. That here's this woman who by all intents and purposes in that culture has no value. She has no value as an individual. She has no value as a woman or as a slave. She has no value because she is not one of those whose the covenant promise is made with. However, God still sees her. God still comes to her. God still blesses her. And it's easy to overlook that. Sarah's obviously not at her best in chapter 21, but neither is Abraham. You'll read, if you read some of the rabbis, they try to put this on Sarah's spiritual insight. I don't buy it. That she's doing this because she sees down the road and that is seeing the fact that Isaac would be the heir, and I think Sarah's just human. And in this moment, this is not one of her better moments. I think Sarah, just like the rest of us, has moments that would just as soon not talk about. Right? I mean, thank God nobody's writing down Jeff's life for people to study later. Right? And people will be going, oh, Jeff did that? Are you kidding? Did you? I mean, we all would say that, right? Thank God that nobody is recording my worst moments when I do something that maybe wasn't part of my best. I think we see that with Abraham and Abimelech. We see that with Abraham and Pharaoh. We see it here with and before with Sarah and Hagar. And here's the exciting part, and we're running out of time, and this is the note I want to leave on, though. That what encourages me about this is that when we get to the New Testament, what are Abraham and Sarah known for? Say it. What? For sojourners, but what are they commended for over and over in the New Testament? Faith, their faithfulness. They're not known as the guy who lies about his wife. They're not known as the woman who abused an Egyptian slave. They're known for their faithfulness. Now, here's why that's important. I think a lot of times in our society, we look at social media, and I compare my blooper reel to somebody else's greatest hits, right? And I look at somebody else's perfect little Facebook life, and I think, man, mine's not like that. I'm going to tell you, theirs isn't either. That you're just seeing the part that's all cropped and cleaned up and Snapchat filtered and put up there. Don't do that to yourself, because God doesn't look. This is the good part. God's looking at my life and not my moments. That's encouraging to me, because Abraham's going to be known as a guy of faith, not as a guy who lied. Sarah's going to be known as a woman of faith, not as this woman who was mean to the slave. And to me, that's encouraging, because growing up, I've told y'all, my church growing up was kind of the Taliban wing of the Church of Christ. And we were taught that, you know, I had to ask forgiveness for everything, or I was going to be, and that someday God's going to take out His book and go, on February 23rd, 1986. And I think what I see here is that maybe I got a shot. You know, maybe God's going to look at the body of work and not the moments. That's the encouragement that I find in this story of Abraham and Sarah. That they're known for faith because the overwhelming faith outweighed the moments of faithlessness. That's what I'm going to hold on to. That's what I'm going to take away from this and try to cling to, that God is looking at my breadth of my life rather than my momentary failures. That's where we're going to leave. We will plug back in. We'll probably skip that treaty and just move on to 22 and the sacrifice next week. So we are out of time. We are going to shut it down and take a few minutes, get out, go to the restroom, say hi to one another, fellowship. That's I say it all the time. Fellowship is one of the most important parts, church. And so get out there and fellowship. I think we have a youth ministry candidate here today. So if you want to meet them, make sure you get a chance to do that. Otherwise, be back in here in 15 minutes. We're going to worship together.